The first snow of December came early that year, dusting the rooftops of Portland in a thin, white layer that looked peaceful from a distance, but hid the chill that sank into every crack of the city. Inside a modest apartment above an old bakery, Evelyn Ward sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the pale light creeping through the blinds. She had been up since dawn, unable to sleep, waiting for a phone call that never came. It was the same phone call she had hoped for every Christmas for the past 3 years, the one where her son would say, "Mom, come home." The silence in the apartment was thick enough to press against her chest. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. The heater hissed and sputtered like it was tired of keeping her alive. She had lived 57 winters, and yet this one felt heavier, as if all the unspoken words and forgotten promises had gathered into the air around her. Evelyn had not always been alone. There had been laughter once, Michael's laughter, small and bright and full of life. She could still see the way he used to run through the snow when he was a child, bundled in his red coat, shouting her name with joy when she picked him up from school. Every memory of him was wrapped in light. She remembered staying up late to finish sewing his clothes for Christmas mornings, remembered saving spare change in a jar just to buy him the sneakers he wanted. She had been a mother who gave everything. And somewhere between all those sacrifices, she had forgotten to keep something for herself. When Michael went to college, she told herself it was normal that he called less often. When he met Clara, she convinced herself it was normal that he spent holidays with her family instead. But when the invitations stopped coming altogether, when the photos on social media showed a life where she no longer existed, something in her began to fracture. The fracture had turned into a quiet canyon inside her chest. 2 years earlier, she had received a call from him that still replayed in her mind. He had sounded distant, polite, almost rehearsed. He had said that Christmas would be different this year, that Clara's parents were visiting, that maybe next time they could make plans. The next time never came. That was the year Evelyn stopped decorating her tree. She kept the ornaments packed away, the ones with his name painted in gold, the ones they had made together when he was 5. Now another Christmas approached, and the city outside glowed with lights that felt like mockery. In shop windows, mannequins smiled with perfect plastic faces, families rushed through the cold with bags of gifts, and carols played on repeat. Inside her apartment, Evelyn felt the slow ache of being forgotten. She wasn't bitter, not yet, just tired. That morning, she received a letter from the landlord reminding her that rent would increase in January. She folded it neatly and placed it beside the stack of unpaid bills. She would manage somehow. She always did. But that afternoon, as she tried to distract herself with housework, the phone rang. She froze, her heart stuttering in her chest. Michael's name glowed on the screen. Her hands trembled as she answered. The sound of his voice hit her like a wave. He sounded older, confident, the way he did when he spoke to clients, because that was what he had become, a man who measured affection in professionalism. He told her that things were hectic, that Clara's family was hosting a big holiday retreat, and that maybe she should take it easy this year. There was no anger in his tone, just detachment, as if he were offering polite advice to a stranger. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat and said she understood. She always understood. After the call, she placed the phone on the table and sat for a long time, staring at the wall. Outside, children laughed in the snow. Inside, Evelyn felt the sound drain from the world. That night, she couldn't eat. She couldn't cry either. Instead, she walked to the window and watched the lights flicker in the distance. For a moment, she saw her reflection. Lined face, tired eyes, hair silvering like frost. She thought of the years she had spent holding everything together, and she realized that in trying to protect everyone else from pain, she had forgotten how to protect herself. The following week passed in slow motion. Evelyn went to work at the community library, shelving books and pretending to read the smiles of the people who passed by. She listened to colleagues talk about their family plans, about gifts and reunions, and nodded politely. No one asked about hers. She had become invisible in the same way an old chair blends into a corner. Useful, but unnoticed. On Friday evening, as she was closing up, she found a small stack of donated books left on the counter. One of them was a leather-bound journal, untouched, its pages blank. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. On the first page, someone had written in pencil, "Every ending is a beginning in disguise." She didn't know why, but the words hit her like a whisper from fate. She tucked the journal into her bag. That night, she began to write. At first, it was just fragments, memories, confessions, things she wished she had said to her son. But slowly, her writing turned into something else, a record, a reflection, and then a plan. Writing gave her clarity, and with clarity came anger. It wasn't loud anger, but cold, sharp, deliberate. She wrote about Clara's fake smiles, about the way Michael had changed after the wedding, about the humiliating dinner when Clara had corrected her pronunciation in front of everyone. She wrote until her hand cramped and her tears dried. By the time she stopped, dawn had painted the window pale blue. Evelyn closed the journal and looked at her reflection again. For the first time in years, she didn't just see an old woman. She saw someone waiting for justice. Weeks passed. On her way home from work one afternoon, she stopped by a small cafe she used to visit with Michael. It had changed. New owners, new furniture, but the same old smell of roasted coffee beans lingered. She sat near the window and noticed the familiar face at the counter. It was one of Michael's former colleagues, Andrew. He recognized her and came over, awkward but kind. They talked briefly, and somewhere in that conversation, Evelyn learned something that froze her blood. Andrew mentioned that Michael's company had been struggling, that money had gone missing, that internal audits were happening quietly. Evelyn didn't know why, but Clara's name flashed through her mind. That night, she couldn't sleep again. She opened her laptop, searched through public records, and started digging. It wasn't difficult. She found a business registration under Clara's maiden name connected to an offshore account. The dates matched the missing funds. Her heart pounded as she pieced the puzzle together. It was no longer just about heartbreak. It was about betrayal, layered, hidden, and cruel. Evelyn printed everything she found, carefully labeling each page, sliding them into envelopes. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how far Clara had gone to isolate her. Emails, forged signatures, even small manipulations designed to make Michael doubt his mother. It was as if Clara had built a wall brick by brick, cutting Evelyn out of her own son's life. She remembered the subtle digs at her clothes, the backhanded compliments, the way Clara had once smiled and said, "Michael tells me you're very traditional." It had sounded harmless then. Now it felt like poison. The days grew colder. Snow turned the city into a landscape of silence. Evelyn continued working, continued gathering. The act of uncovering truth became her purpose. Each document, each clue, gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. On the surface, nothing changed. She still smiled politely to neighbors, still carried groceries up the stairs, still drank her coffee alone. But underneath, she was no longer the same woman. The sadness had transformed into quiet determination. As Christmas approached, invitations filled the city, office parties, church gatherings, festive dinners, but Evelyn ignored them all. Instead, she spent her evenings sorting through files, creating a timeline that told the real story of Clara's deceit. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with it, but she knew that when the time came, she would be ready. One afternoon, while reviewing the documents, she found a small detail that made her stop. Clara's secret account wasn't only linked to Michael's company, it was also connected to a man named Stephen Grant. Evelyn remembered the name from somewhere. After hours of searching, she found him, a contractor who had worked on Clara's family estate years ago. There were rumors online, faint traces of gossip, an affair, a scandal covered up quietly. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the air leaving her lungs slowly. Everything fit. Clara had not only stolen from Michael, but had been unfaithful as well. The betrayal was complete. That night, she dreamed of snow falling on a silent street, of footsteps leading away from her house, of a door closing softly but forever. When she woke, the decision had already formed in her heart. She would not confront them in private. She would not scream or beg or demand. She would reveal the truth where it could never be ignored. The opportunity came when she saw an article online about the annual Portland Charity Gala, a grand event attended by business owners, socialites, and donors. Clara and Michael were on the guest list. Her hands trembled as she read the names. Fate was calling, and she was ready to answer. In the days leading up to the gala, she prepared quietly. She bought a secondhand dress from a thrift store, elegant but understated. She printed her evidence, sealed it in envelopes, and wrote a letter, not of anger but of truth. She rehearsed what she would say if anyone asked why she was there, though deep down she knew she wouldn't need to explain. On Christmas Eve, as the city glimmered under the weight of falling snow, Evelyn stood before her mirror one last time. Her reflection looked back at her, not the fragile mother who waited for a call, but a woman reborn in the fire of her own heartbreak. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped into the cold. The wind bit at her cheeks, the snow crunching under her boots. Around her, carolers sang in distant harmony, lights twinkled from apartment windows, and the world moved as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. But inside her, everything had already changed. The taxi ride to the hotel was silent. She watched the city blur past, the glowing advertisements and traffic lights fading into streaks of color. The driver glanced at her in the mirror once or twice, as if sensing the weight she carried. When she arrived, the doorman greeted her politely, unaware of who she was or what she had come to do. Inside, the ballroom glowed with chandeliers and laughter. Music floated through the air, mingling with the clink of champagne glasses. People moved in polished rhythms, their smiles practiced, their words rehearsed. Evelyn moved through them like a ghost, unseen, unnoticed, but entirely present. And as she stepped closer to the stage, her pulse steady and calm, the story of her life, the love, the loss, the betrayal, felt like it was leading to this very moment. The hotel's ballroom shimmered beneath the crystal chandeliers, each reflection catching the movement of gowns and tuxedos like fragments of a dream. The scent of perfume and polished silver mingled with the faint sweetness of champagne. Beneath all the elegance, Evelyn felt a hum of nervous electricity, the kind that belongs to people who believe they have control over their lives. She stood near the back wall, holding a glass of water she never intended to drink, watching her son laugh among the guests. Michael looked older than she remembered, sharper around the edges, his smile practiced. The sight of him filled her with an ache that was neither love nor hate, but something between, a sorrow so deep it had learned how to stand on its own. Clara stood beside him, radiant and false, her laughter ringing out too clearly, too confidently. Every move she made was a small performance. every glance a silent claim of ownership. Evelyn could feel her pulse a steadying with each breath. She was not here for confrontation or recognition. She was here to let truth move through the room like winter wind, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. She waited as speeches began, the rhythm of polite applause marking time like a metronome. At the edge of the stage sat a table with envelopes of donations, microphones, a small screen projecting the charity's name in gold letters. When the coordinator invited anyone who wished to make a final statement, Evelyn stepped forward before she could change her mind. The crowd turned, a ripple of surprise spreading as the older woman in the thrifted dress walked toward the microphone. Someone whispered her name. Michael's face drained of color. Clara's hand tightened around her glass. The light seemed too bright, but Evelyn no longer cared. The silence that met her arrival felt like justice holding its breath. She placed her envelope on the podium and began to speak, not with bitterness, but with the calm of someone who had carried truth for too long and was finally setting it down. Her voice rose and fell like the rhythm of snowfall, each sentence revealing a piece of the hidden story. She spoke of trust, of betrayal, of how love can be twisted when pride becomes its master. She spoke of money moved in shadows, of names written where they did not belong, of hearts broken not by strangers, but by the people they had fed and raised. She never said Clara's name, yet every ear in the room heard it echo between the lines. Murmurs began, low at first, then louder. Phones appeared in trembling hands. The charity director leaned forward, confused. And then Evelyn unfolded the documents she had carried in her small black purse. She held them up, the signatures, the transfers, the dates. A few guests gasped, and the whispers became a current moving through the hall. Michael stared at her like a man seeing a ghost. Clara's face went pale beneath her makeup. Evelyn finished speaking and placed the papers gently on the podium, as if laying flowers on a grave. She thanked the audience for their attention, wished them a joyful Christmas, and walked away before anyone could stop her. Outside the ballroom doors, the cold air rushed in like mercy. She felt no triumph, only stillness. Snow had begun again, fine white flakes swirling through the streetlights. Each one melted on her skin, tiny moments of disappearance. She walked past parked cars and laughing strangers, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, the city pulsing around her as if unaware that one life had just changed forever. By the time she reached the corner, the noise from the gala had already faded into distance. Behind her, chaos bloomed. Questions, denials, explanations, but she kept walking, steady and silent. That night she returned to her apartment and sat by the window without turning on the light. The city spread before her like a field of stars. Somewhere in those streets, her son was watching the life he built unravel, piece by piece. She didn't wish him pain, only truth. Truth was the only thing that could break the spell Clara had cast over him. She stayed awake until dawn, her heart strangely light. For the first time in years, she did not feel small. She did not feel forgotten. She felt real. Morning came gray and cold. News traveled quickly through Portland's social circles. By midday, headlines whispered of fraud investigations, of scandal, of names quietly removed from boards and committees. She didn't seek them out, but fragments reached her anyway. Texts from old acquaintances, voicemails filled with pity disguised as curiosity. She deleted them all. Days turned into weeks. Christmas passed like a sigh. She went back to the library, reshelving books with the same steady rhythm. But beneath her calm exterior, something was shifting again. Revenge, she discovered, was not a clean act. It left residue, the ache of memory, the echo of loss. One afternoon in early January, as she returned home from work, she found an envelope wedged under her door. No name, just her address in Michael's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a short note asking if they could meet. She read it twice, then placed it on the table beside the cold coffee cup that had become her companion. She didn't answer right away. She let the days stretch out, testing her heart for what it wanted, to punish or to understand. On the third day, she wrote back. A single sentence it meant to meet at the park where he had learned to ride his bike. She didn't know if he would come, and she wasn't sure she cared. But when Saturday arrived, she went anyway, walking slowly through the brittle sunlight of winter morning. The park was quiet. Snow lay thick along the path, and the frozen pond reflected a sky the color of steel. She sat on a bench, gloved hands folded in her lap, breath clouding in the air. Time passed, and for a while she thought he wouldn't appear. Then she saw him, standing at the far end of the path, hesitant, older, burdened. He walked toward her through the snow.
Snow crunched beneath the shoes, each step deliberate, each movement shaped by years of unspoken words. Evelyn watched him approach and saw traces of the boy she once knew, the same slant of his shoulders, the same hesitant rhythm of his walk, but time had thinned the innocence out of him. What remained was a man struggling against the weight of choices he could no longer justify. When he reached her, he didn't sit immediately. He stood there in silence, breath rising in clouds, eyes searching her face for something familiar. She could see the turmoil in him, the conflict between shame and the longing to be forgiven. It was strange, she thought, how distance could stretch across only a few feet and still feel endless. He finally sat beside her. The sound of the frozen branches swaying overhead filled the silence between them. The park was empty except for a distant jogger and the soft hum of traffic beyond the trees. The world seemed to be holding its breath for them. She didn't turn her head, but she felt his presence like a pulse against the cold. Time folded back on itself, revealing fragments of the past. Birthday candles, scraped knees, the warmth of small arms clinging to her neck. For a moment, she wanted to speak, to break the silence that had stretched for years, but words felt too heavy. So she let the air carry the weight for both of them. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the bench between them. It was worn around the edges, the way paper becomes when handled too many times. She stared at it, then at his gloved hand retreating. The envelope sat there like a fragile truth, trembling in the cold. Inside, when she later opened it, there would be a photograph, one she had never seen before. A picture of her son as a teenager, standing with his father in front of the house they had lost. On the back, in faded ink, a message written by her husband before he died. No matter how far we fall, love finds its way home. But she didn't open it yet. Not there, not in front of him. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the frozen pond where sunlight fractured across the ice like broken glass. The silence stretched again, but now it was softer. There was no anger left in it, only exhaustion. Evelyn realized that vengeance had done what it was meant to do. It had forced truth into the open, but it could not rebuild what had been destroyed. Only understanding could do that, and understanding was slower, quieter, and harder to live with. They sat together for a long time, neither moving nor speaking. Somewhere behind them, a church bell chimed noon. When she finally rose to leave, Michael didn't follow her. He stayed seated, staring down at the snow between his boots, as if the answers he sought might be buried there. Evelyn walked away without looking back. The photograph in her pocket felt warm despite the cold. Each step she took seemed lighter than the one before, as though she were walking out of the shadow of her own grief. That evening, she returned home and placed the photograph on her windowsill. Outside, the city lights flickered against the gathering dusk. The sound of sirens and laughter drifted up from the streets, blending into something strangely peaceful. She made tea, wrapped herself in a shawl, and let the quiet fill the room. The following weeks unfolded with the patience of recovery. Investigations continued. Clara disappeared from the public eye, her carefully built reputation collapsing under the weight of exposure. There were rumors of her leaving the country, whispers of debts unpaid and alliances broken. Evelyn didn't follow the details. She had spent too many years watching other people's lives while neglecting her own. One morning in February, she woke before dawn and decided to travel. She took the photograph, a small suitcase, and boarded a train heading south. The landscape outside the windows shifted from frost to fog to open fields, washed in early sunlight. She watched it all without expectation, as if relearning how to see the world again. In a small town near the coast, she rented a room above a bakery that smelled of yeast and vanilla. The owner was kind, and the rhythm of small-town life suited her. She spent her mornings walking along the cliffs where gulls wheeled overhead and her evenings reading by the sea-facing window. The ocean became her confessional, endless, patient, forgiving. One afternoon, as she sat sketching the shoreline in a notebook, a storm began to rise. The wind howled, lifting her hair, scattering the pages across the sand. She laughed, chasing them down like a child, breathless and alive. For the first time in years, the sound of her own laughter surprised her. It didn't sound like a stranger anymore. That night, rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled over the sea. She stood at the glass, watching the waves shatter against the rocks, and thought about everything she had lost and everything she had learned to live without. Revenge, she realized, was not an ending, but a passage. It had burned away the illusions, leaving behind something cleaner, sharper, truer. When morning came, the storm was gone. The air smelled of salt and renewal. Evelyn took the photograph from her bedside table and placed it on the windowsill, where sunlight fell across the faded image. For the first time, she smiled without sorrow.
Spring crept into the seaside town like a secret. The air softened, the gulls called longer, and the cliffs turned green where winter had left them bare. Evelyn found herself walking farther each morning, tracing the edge of the water where the tide left trails of foam like handwriting only the sea could read. The bakery's bells marked her days. The scent of bread and coffee became the clock by which she lived. Months had passed since she left Portland. The past felt like an old book now, one she had read too many times but no longer needed to open. Yet memory has a way of writing itself in invisible ink, waiting for the right kind of light to appear again. That light came in May, folded neatly inside an envelope bearing a familiar name. It arrived with the Morning Post, tucked between a grocery bill and a local newsletter. The handwriting was unmistakable, measured, deliberate, the same as the one on the note he'd once left beneath her door. Michael. She held it for a long while before opening it. Her heart beat slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid of remembering too much at once. Inside was a single page, the ink slightly smudged at the edges. The words were few, but heavy, shaped by remorse. He wrote that Clara had vanished after the investigation ended, leaving debts that swallowed what remained of his company. He wrote that he had sold their house and was leaving the city for good, hoping to start somewhere new. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, only the faint possibility that she might one day remember him as the boy who used to run barefoot through her garden. Evelyn folded the letter once, twice, then placed it beside the photograph on her windowsill. For a long time she watched them both, the picture of what was, the letter of what might have been. The wind outside shifted, carrying the sound of waves through the open window. She closed her eyes and listened, letting the tide speak the things she could not. That night she dreamed of a house with blue shutters, standing alone on a hill. Inside, the rooms were filled with light, and somewhere, faintly, a piano played. When she woke, the sound still lingered in her ears, half memory, half imagination. She realized then that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a long, quiet practice, like breathing or walking beside the sea. Over the next few weeks, she began to write again. Not letters, not journals, just fragments, observations, thoughts about the color of waves at dusk, about how time folds around pain until it becomes almost tender. The notebook that had once held sketches now filled with words, slow and deliberate. She wasn't writing for anyone else. She was building a bridge between the woman she had been and the one she was becoming. One morning in early June, as sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, a stranger knocked at her door. It was the bakery owner's niece, a university student spending the summer by the coast. She had been helping with deliveries and had brought Evelyn a loaf still warm from the oven. They began to talk, first about the sea, then about books, then about nothing and everything. The girl's laughter filled the small kitchen, bright and unguarded. After she left, Evelyn found herself smiling. The sound of that laughter lingered, reminding her of a life she had forgotten how to imagine. A life not defined by loss, but by the simple act of being seen, of being part of the world again. The town's rhythms wrapped around her gently. She became part of its quiet pulse, attending small markets, helping the baker during busy mornings, tending to a garden that grew wild with rosemary and lavender. Each day layered itself softly over the one before, until even the sharpest edges of memory began to smooth. Yet peace, like the tide, is never still for long. Late one afternoon, as she was closing the shutters against a rising wind, she noticed a man standing near the shore, looking toward her house. His figure was indistinct at first, blurred by mist, but as he moved closer, something in the tilt of his shoulders made her heart stutter. It wasn't Michael. This man was younger, taller, unfamiliar. But in his stance was something she recognized, an echo of the same burden she had once carried. He lingered there for several minutes, then disappeared down the path toward the harbor. The next morning, she saw him again, sitting outside the bakery, reading a newspaper. When their eyes met briefly through the window, he offered a nod, not of greeting, but of recognition, as if he somehow knew her story. Over the following days, she saw him often, walking the cliffs, writing in a small notebook, occasionally sketching the horizon. The townspeople said he was a journalist staying for the season, researching a book about coastal towns that had survived economic collapse. But Evelyn sensed there was something else beneath his presence, an intent too focused, a gaze too careful. Then, one evening, a letter arrived at her door. No stamp, no address, just her name written in precise, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. The past has tides of its own. She froze. The words carried a chill she hadn't felt in years. She searched the horizon that night for any sign of the stranger, but the beach was empty, the wind heavy with salt. Days later, she discovered what it meant. The journalist wasn't writing about the town at all. He was investigating the collapse of the charity and the financial scandal that had once bound her life to ruin. He had traced every name, every signature, and now he wanted her story. Evelyn stood at her window as dusk fell, the sea darkening to a bruise-colored blue. The life she had built here, quiet and unassuming, trembled at the edge of exposure once more. She knew that if her name surfaced in his work, it would bring the past roaring back. Michael, Clara, the scandal, the whispers. Everything she had buried would rise again. But maybe, she thought, that was what the sea had been teaching her all along, that nothing stays buried forever. The tide always returns, carrying with it what we tried to forget. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her table, the letter spread before her, the sound of waves beating steadily against the shore. The stranger wanted the truth, and for the first time she wondered whether she owed it to him, to herself, or to the world that had never truly known what happened. The morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of light that makes the sea look endless. Evelyn left her window open as she dressed, the cool air threading through her hair like invisible fingers. She could feel the decision she'd made during the night solidifying inside her. Not like courage exactly, but like acceptance. The past had come knocking again, and she would no longer hide behind silence. When she reached the cafe by the harbor, the journalist was already there. He sat at the far table, his notebook open, pen poised above the page. The air smelled of coffee and seaweed, the soft murmur of voices rising and falling like waves. Evelyn ordered tea and sat opposite him without ceremony. The look he gave her was one of curiosity, not surprise, as if he had known she would come. He asked questions that morning, not cruelly, not carelessly, but with the quiet precision of someone trying to understand how truth breaks people open. She answered what she could, sometimes with long pauses, sometimes not at all. She told him about the charity, about the betrayal that had turned love into suspicion, about the night in the ballroom when she'd finally spoken. She told him how revenge had freed her but also hollowed her, how silence afterward had been its own kind of punishment. As she spoke, something inside her shifted. Words she had once locked away began to flow like water through cracked stone. By the time she finished, her tea had gone cold. The journalist wrote a final note, then closed his book and sat back. There was respect in his eyes, not pity, but the kind of recognition that passes between survivors. When she left the cafe, the wind had picked up, carrying gulls inland. The horizon shimmered, half mist, half memory. She didn't look back to see if he was watching her. Some things didn't need witnesses anymore. Over the next week, she noticed small changes in the town. Whispers that the stranger was leaving soon, that his book was nearly finished. People spoke of him with curiosity, the way small towns do when an outsider comes and goes, leaving behind ripples of mystery. Evelyn continued her quiet routines, baking bread, tending her garden, walking the cliffs at dawn. But beneath that stillness, she could feel an undercurrent, the slow gathering of something inevitable. One evening, as the sun bled out over the sea, she received another letter. This one bore a publishing house's seal. The book, it said, would be released in autumn. A copy would be sent to her address as promised. There was no note from the journalist, no explanation, just a date and a simple closing line, for those who spoke when silence was easier. When the book arrived months later, it was heavier than she expected. The cover showed a coastline under storm clouds, the title printed in austere gray letters. She turned the pages slowly, heart steady, until she reached the final chapter. Her story was there, not by name, but unmistakably hers. The details were blurred to protect identities, but the emotion was intact, raw and luminous. It wasn't a story of revenge anymore. It was a story of survival. Reading it felt like standing before a mirror she had avoided for too long. She saw herself reflected not as the woman who had lost everything, but as the one who dared to face the fire. The world would never know her name, yet her truth had found a way to live. She closed the book and set it beside the photograph and letter on her windowsill. Together, they formed a kind of altar, to grief, to forgiveness, to endurance. The sea outside murmured like a lullaby. That night, she dreamed again of the house with blue shutters, but this time, it wasn't empty. The rooms glowed with warm light, and the windows were open to the wind. She walked through the room slowly, her steps echoing softly across the wooden floor. In one of the rooms, a piano waited by the window and the same melody played, only now it sounded like peace. She woke to birdsong and a thin wash of sunlight across her bed. For a moment she lay still, listening to the world returning to itself. Then she rose, brewed her tea, and walked to the water's edge. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath her feet. Evelyn stood there for a long time, watching the horizon blur where sea met sky. There was no anger left in her, no lingering sense of victory or loss. There was only life, steady, imperfect, vast. The sea had taught her everything she needed to know, that even the fiercest storms eventually give way to calm, and that the wreckage left behind is not always a tragedy. Sometimes it's the shape of beginning again. As she turned to leave, a piece of driftwood rolled toward her feet, polished smooth by years of waves. She picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the grain beneath her fingers, then set it gently back into the tide. The current caught it and carried it away, slow, deliberate, unresisting, until it vanished into the open water. In that small gesture, something closed and something opened. The wind lifted her hair, the sea breathed its endless breath, and she walked back toward the town, her shadow stretching long and golden across the sand.